In the year 1845, Mississippi stood at the heart of the Cotton Kingdom. Fields of white stretched endlessly beneath the scorching sun. Each harvest brought wealth to the masters, yet every stalk was paid for in chains. The system thrived on obedience and silence. It sought to crush all who lived within its grip. Yet among the enslaved there came a story unlike any other. 3 children were born at once. Triplets. To the enslaved it was a sign of hope. To the masters it was a sign of fear. From their first breaths they carried a spirit that would not bow. Their childhood was marked by labor and pain, yet their will grew stronger with each trial. Their defiance unsettled those who claimed to own them. They were beaten, yet they did not yield. They were threatened, yet they did not fall. Their story did not survive in records or ledgers. It lived in whispers carried through generations. This is the story of the triplets, the children who could not be controlled. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. It is the year 1845 in Mississippi. The air hangs heavy with heat, and the fields seem endless. Cotton plants stretch across the horizon like a white ocean beneath the burning sun. This is the empire of cotton, an empire built on the forced labor of enslaved men, women, and children. Every stalk pulled from the soil carries the weight of human suffering. Every bale shipped down the river feeds a system of profit and cruelty. Plantations dominate the land. They are not just farms. They are engines of wealth for the few and prisons for the many. In these fields, voices are silenced under the crack of the overseer's whip. Families live under the constant threat of separation. Children grow up never knowing freedom. Generations are chained to the soil they did not choose. On one such plantation, something unusual occurs. 3 children enter the world at once. Triplets, born not into celebration but into bondage. Their first cries are heard not as blessings but as burdens by those who claim to own them. To the master, they are numbers to be counted. More hands for the fields one day. To the enslaved community, their birth carries a different meaning. Whispers move through the quarters that 3 born together mark a sign of strength, a sign of spirit that no chains can break. The world they are born into is already decided. From their first breath, they belong to someone else. Their bodies are considered property. Their futures are written in ledgers beside cattle and tools. Yet something about these children unsettles their masters. Even as infants, they seem bound together by an energy that cannot be contained. The plantation itself breathes with contradictions. Its rows are neat and orderly, but behind them lies chaos. The enslaved rise before dawn to toil until dark. Sweat falls into the soil as cotton is pulled from thorny plants. Overseers ride through the fields with watchful eyes and harsh commands. The sound of forced labor fills the air like a constant drumbeat. Still in the shadows of this oppression there flickers something different, something alive. The triplets grow day by day. They do not yet know the weight of their world, but already their presence disturbs the balance. To their masters they are a reminder that control is never complete. To their people they are a quiet symbol that even in the harshest soil new life takes root. In the heart of Mississippi's Cotton Kingdom a story begins. A story that will not follow the rules the masters have written. The night the triplets were born, the plantation held its breath. Within the wooden walls of a slave cabin, 3 cries rose into the air at once. 3 voices joined together, as if the world itself had shifted. For the enslaved community, the moment was extraordinary. In whispers passed from one person to another, it was said that children born in threes carried meaning that reached far beyond the fields of cotton. In the stories that survived the crossing from Africa, triplets were not ordinary children. They were marked by the spirit world. They carried signs of strength, resilience, and sometimes danger for those who sought to control them. Elders remembered fragments of these beliefs. They spoke of triplets as children destined for a life greater than the one forced upon them. In a world where hope was rare, this birth became a spark. The masters saw it differently. To them, 3 children born at once were not a blessing but a burden. 3 new mouths to feed in infancy. 3 children who might one day resist or lead others astray. The idea of unity among the enslaved was their greatest fear. Control depended on isolation, on breaking bonds. on making each person feel alone. But triplets could not be separated so easily. They carried a bond from the moment of birth, a bond no whip could cut. As the days passed, the whispers spread. Mothers looked at their own children and wondered if change could come. Fathers, who had long carried silence in their hearts, felt something stir again. Even those who had lost faith in any deliverance began to watch the triplets with quiet reverence. Their survival itself felt like a form of defiance. The plantation tried to carry on with its endless rhythm of labor. Dawn to dusk in the fields, cotton picked until fingers bled, overseers barking commands under the burning Mississippi Sunday. Yet within the quarters after nightfall, the talk returned again and again to the three infants. People spoke in hushed tones so the overseer would not hear. They said the triplets were a sign, a message from ancestors, proof that even in chains the spirit of a people could not be crushed. The master dismissed these talks as superstition, but he too felt unease. He noticed how the enslaved lingered near the cabin of the triplets' mother, how songs rose longer and stronger in the evening. He could not name it, but he knew something had shifted. The balance of power had trembled in the smallest of ways. 3 children lay wrapped in cloth on a dirt floor. Their lives were already written in the ledgers of ownership. Yet, in the minds of the people who cradled them, they represented something far greater. They were not simply infants. They were an omen. They were resilience made flesh. And to the masters who sought control, they were the beginning of a threat that could not be ignored. The triplets grew beneath the heavy shadow of the plantation. Their first steps were not taken in grassy meadows, but on hard-packed earth worn by the feet of the enslaved. They learned to walk near the fields. They learned to run only within limits. The boundaries of their world were fences overseers, and the unspoken rule that every child born into bondage belonged not to their mother or father but to the master. Even as children, they were expected to carry weight. Small tasks at first: gathering water, picking up scraps of cotton left behind by tired hands. Chores meant to prepare them for the endless work that would define their lives. Other children on the plantation knew the same fate. Childhood was not a time of play but a brief training ground for obedience. Yet the triplets did not take to obedience easily. They shared a bond that no master could understand. What one felt, the others seemed to sense. If one resisted, the others followed. When told to sit still, they whispered stories to each other. When ordered to fetch, they moved slowly on purpose. They laughed in moments where silence was demanded. These were small acts, yet each one was dangerous. To defy, even in the slightest way, was to invite punishment. But the triplets seemed to carry within them an instinct to push back against control. Their mother watched with both pride and fear. She saw the spark in their eyes and remembered the whispers that marked their birth as an omen. She also knew the lash was never far away. A child who tested limits too often would learn pain early. She tried to guide them with gentle warnings. She told them stories of survival. She reminded them that patience could be a weapon. But she also saw that their spirit was not easily bent. The overseer noticed too. He saw how the triplets clung together, how they moved as if one thought guided them. It unsettled him. He believed children should learn submission young so they would not question it later. But with these 3, there was always a flicker of defiance. A glance held too long. A task left unfinished. A silence that felt heavier than words. As the years passed, the triplets grew taller. Their hands grew rough from labor. Their shoulders carried burdens too heavy for their age. Yet even within that life of chains, they carved out moments of their own choosing. They found ways to play in the dust after work. They whispered secrets under the moonlight. They shared stolen bites of food. In these small ways, they claimed pieces of themselves that no master could own. Childhood in bondage was a childhood of limits. But for the triplets, each day also carried a quiet rebellion. Even when forced to bend their backs in the fields, they stood together in spirit. Even when taught obedience, they remembered freedom in the way they laughed. And in those fragile moments, the enslaved community saw the truth. These children would not be easy to control. The overseer was a man whose presence brought silence to the quarters. His boots struck the dirt with authority, and every step reminded the enslaved of the power he carried. His whip was never far from his hand, and his voice was sharp enough to cut through any laughter. For most children, the sound of his approach was enough to end play and bring obedience, but the triplets were different. They did not cower in the same way. Their eyes followed him not with fear but with a quiet fire that unsettled him. At first he thought it was childish stubbornness that time and punishment would correct. When one of them moved too slowly, he struck them with the flat of his hand. When another spoke out of turn, he made them kneel in the dust until their knees burned. Yet the very next day the defiance remained. The look in their eyes grew sharper. The silence they held was not submission but endurance. The overseer began to watch them more closely. He noticed how they never truly stood alone. If he punished one, the other two stayed near. If he shouted at one, the others stiffened as though the words were hurled at all of them. The bond between them was not broken by fear. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger. And this unsettled more than just the overseer. It unsettled the master as well, who expected obedience to be absolute. Among the enslaved, the sight of 3 children who did not bow so easily began to stir whispers. People noticed how they carried themselves. Even in punishment they did not break. Even in silence their presence spoke. It gave others something dangerous. A spark of courage. A reminder that resistance was still possible, even if it was small. The overseer could sense this ripple moving through the quarters. He knew that control relied on fear. If fear weakened even slightly, the entire system trembled. That was why he watched the triplets with suspicion. They were children, but they carried weight far beyond their years. Their stubbornness was not simple mischief. It was something deeper. Something that threatened the order he was sworn to keep. As weeks turned into months, the punishments grew harsher. Yet the result was always the same. Bruises faded, whispers spread, and the triplets endured. Their defiance did not end with them. It began to echo quietly through the lives of others. A mother who once kept her head low now sang louder during evening prayers. A boy who once worked in silence began to glance at the overseer with narrowed eyes. The ripple was spreading, and though small, it was real. The overseer had broken many before, but with these 3, the more he struck, the stronger they seemed to stand. And in that truth lay a growing fear, not only for him but for the entire plantation. The nights on the plantation carried a different rhythm than the days. When the sun fell and the overseer's shadow vanished into the master's house, the enslaved gathered quietly in the quarters. Voices lowered. Fires glowed faintly. It was here in the hours of darkness that the elders spoke. For the triplets, these hours became a second education. One not written in ledgers or marked by the lash, but carried in whispers and memory. Old men who could no longer bend their backs in the fields leaned close to tell them of survival. They spoke of how to walk softly so as not to be heard, how to listen more than speak, how to hide strength behind stillness. These were lessons the overseer could never teach, for they were meant not to serve the master but to outlast him. Elder women shared knowledge too. They passed down healing with roots and leaves. They showed the children which plants could soothe pain and which ones could sicken a hound trained to track runaways. They told them how songs held more than melody. A tune hummed in the fields might be a map in disguise. A rhythm tapped on a barrel could speak of directions to freedom. The children learned that resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it moved silently like a shadow that refused to die. The triplets also heard stories that carried them across oceans. The elders spoke of Africa not as a distant place, but as a living memory. They told of villages where families were whole, of dances where drums spoke the language of the people, of kings and queens whose names had not been forgotten. These stories were fragments, but they planted roots in the minds of the children. They grew up knowing they came from more than chains. The elders did not shy from tales of rebellion either. They spoke of men and women who had run into the swamps and carved out lives as maroons, hidden communities of the free. They told of uprisings where enslaved people struck back against their masters, even when the price was death. These were dangerous words, yet they were shared with care. The triplets listened with wide eyes as if every syllable added strength to their bones. Through these lessons, seeds of defiance were planted. The children began to understand that every act of survival carried meaning. To endure was itself resistance. To remember was power. And to hold fast to one another was the greatest weapon they could wield. The master believed he owned their bodies. The overseer believed he could bend their wills. But in the quiet hours of the night, the elders gave the triplets something that could not be chained. They gave them knowledge. They gave them memory. They gave them the vision of a life beyond the fields. And though the children were still young, the roots of resistance had already begun to grow within them. By the mid-1840s, Mississippi stood at the heart of what many called the Cotton Kingdom. The soil was rich. The rivers carried endless bales to the markets of the North and across the ocean to Europe. Cotton had become the lifeblood of the South. Every acre of land was turned into rows of white that stretched further each year. But behind this prosperity lay hunger. Not the hunger of empty bellies, but the hunger of greed. The master wanted more and more. Every season demanded higher yields. Every hand in the fields was driven harder to meet the demand. For the enslaved, this meant cruelty deepened. The lash fell quicker. The hours stretched longer. Children were pushed into labor before their bodies were ready. The triplets were no exception. Their childhood ended not with a choice but with the master's orders. By adolescence, they were placed in the rows of cotton from dawn until darkness. The sacks they dragged were nearly as long as their bodies. Their fingers bled from thorns. Their backs bent under the weight of expectation. The overseer rode through the fields like a shadow that never left. His whip cracked to keep the pace steady. Anyone who slowed faced punishment. Anyone who dropped their sack risked being tied to the post. The triplets learned quickly how to work with precision, not because they accepted their fate, but because survival required it. Yet within their obedience there remained a spark of defiance. They whispered to one another as they moved. They turned their labor into a rhythm that belonged to them. They endured together. Their bodies began to show the marks of this life. Scars on their shoulders where the straps cut deep. Scars on their backs from the lash. Calluses that grew thick across their palms. Each mark told a story of cruelty, yet none of these wounds bent their spirits. Pain became a language they understood but refused to let define them. The Cotton Kingdom demanded endless sacrifice. It consumed not just the strength of men and women, but their futures. Families were torn apart to feed its appetite. Nights were filled with exhaustion rather than rest. Still, within this harsh order, the triplets carried what the elders had given them: memory, knowledge, and the certainty that chains did not own their souls. As the bales of cotton grew higher and the master counted his profit, the overseer still watched the three with unease. Their hands worked, but their eyes told another story. A story of endurance. A story of fire not yet extinguished. The Cotton Kingdom had taken their childhood, but it had not taken their will. And that truth was more dangerous than any whip could silence. The nights on the plantation carried more than songs and prayers. They carried whispers. Whispers that traveled like wind from one quarter to the next. From one plantation to another. Stories told in fragments. Stories heavy with risk, yet filled with hope. Among these stories, the triplets first heard the name of Nat Turner. They learned that in Virginia years earlier, Turner had led a rising of the enslaved. Men and women who refused to bow had risen in the dark of night. They struck back against their masters, and for a brief moment, the balance of power broke. The rebellion was crushed, but the memory of it was not. It lived in the voices of the elders who had carried the tale across states. It lived in the hushed tones of mothers who warned their children that freedom always carried a cost. The triplets listened with wide eyes. To them, the story was more than a tale. It was proof that resistance was not a dream, but a memory written into history. Turner had been punished. His followers killed or sold away. Yet the act itself was a spark that could not be extinguished. The very telling of it became defiance. The whispers reached further than Virginia. Some spoke of uprisings in the Caribbean. They told of islands where enslaved people had risen not once but many times. They told of Haiti, where the enslaved had defeated armies and declared a nation of their own. These stories were dangerous to share, yet they spread like fire through dry grass. For every lash meant to silence the enslaved, there was a word passed that reminded them silence was never complete. The triplets carried these stories in their hearts. As they worked the endless rows of cotton, they remembered that others had fought back. As they endured punishment, they remembered that others had paid a greater price for freedom. The overseer saw only their bent backs, but inside them grew a vision larger than the fields. They began to understand that the struggle was not theirs alone, it was shared across time and across oceans. In the quarters at night, their voices joined the circle of listeners. They asked questions. They leaned closer when an elder spoke of rebellion. They learned that chains could be broken not only in dreams but in truth. For the first time, they began to imagine themselves as part of that story. The master believed he had control of their world, but he could not stop the flow of memory carried in whispers. He could not silence the names of those who had risen before: Nat Turner, Haiti, Maroon warriors. Each story was a seed, and in the hearts of the triplets those seeds began to take root. The triplets had carried the lessons of the elders, and the whispers of rebellion deep in their hearts. For years their defiance had been quiet. A glance that lingered too long. A task done slowly. A silence that spoke louder than words. But as they grew into their strength, that silence began to change. Their defiance was no longer hidden in shadows. It began to step into the light. It started with small refusals. One morning, an overseer ordered the eldest of the three to carry a load twice his weight. Instead of obeying, he set it down. He stood still as the whip cracked near his feet, yet he did not lift the sack again. The overseer shouted until his voice grew raw, but the boy's gaze never wavered. It was a moment that passed quickly, yet it was seen by many. Others in the field remembered. Courage often begins in seconds, not in hours. Soon the siblings learned to use their unity in ways that unsettled the order of the plantation. When a younger child was accused of slowing the work, the triplets stepped forward together and claimed the fault as their own. The punishment was delivered to them, but the boy was spared. That day, the overseer realized they were not just three bodies in the field. They were a shield. They absorbed pain so others could breathe. And that made them dangerous. Sabotage followed. A tool left broken without explanation. A wagon axle loosened so it cracked under strain. A water bucket spilled before it reached the rows. Small acts that slowed the relentless pace of cotton without pointing directly to the guilty. The master called it carelessness. The overseer suspected more, but he had no proof. All he saw were three pairs of eyes that never lowered. The enslaved began to notice these patterns. In the quarters after dark, whispers spread again. Some spoke with fear that the triplets were drawing too much attention. Others spoke with pride that they were daring to do what so many longed for. The children of Omen had stepped beyond survival. They had begun to resist openly. The punishments grew harsher. Whips tore at their backs. Food was withheld. Yet still, their spirits did not bow. The overseer struck harder, but every blow deepened the resolve of the three. Pain became the soil where their defiance rooted itself even stronger. What had once been quiet rebellion now walked in plain sight. The triplets no longer tested only themselves. They tested the limits of the system that sought to own them. And with every act of defiance, the balance of fear shifted ever so slightly away from the master and toward the enslaved who watched with new and restless hope. The Cotton Kingdom thrived on order. Every row in the fields was meant to stand straight. Every voice was meant to answer quickly. Every life was meant to remain within the master's grasp. Yet whispers began to travel beyond the quarters. Whispers that three children born together had grown into something more than workers. That punishments did not silence them. That scars did not bend them. The masters heard these whispers, and for the first time they felt the tremor of fear. Fear was not something plantation owners were used to. They carried the law. They carried the whip. They carried the wealth that allowed them to buy and sell lives. Control was their certainty. But the story of the triplets unsettled that certainty. Overseers reported that the siblings worked but never bowed. That punishment seemed to strengthen their resolve. that others in the fields looked to them with eyes that carried something dangerous: hope. The masters knew hope was a contagion. It could spread faster than the crack of a whip. One act of refusal could inspire another. One spark of defiance could ignite into flame. They remembered Nat Turner. They remembered the tales of Haiti, where an island once ruled by chains had torn its masters from power. Those memories lived like shadows in the back of every owner's mind. And now those shadows seemed closer. Rumors began to shift into warnings. Neighbors spoke of strange unity among the enslaved, of songs sung louder in the evenings, of eyes that did not lower when orders were given. Some masters dismissed it as childish gossip. Others saw danger rising and pressed their overseers harder. They demanded stricter punishment, longer hours, tighter control. Yet, the fear remained. Because fear is not erased by cruelty. Fear grows when control begins to slip. The triplets themselves felt the change. They saw how the master's gaze lingered on them longer than before. They heard the tension in the voices of the overseers. They understood that their defiance was no longer invisible. It had become a threat. But instead of breaking them, this knowledge gave them strength. If the masters feared them, it meant the masters could be shaken. Across the plantation, the enslaved spoke carefully. They knew walls had ears, but in the quiet moments between work and rest, the whispers continued. Whispers that the triplets were more than children. Whispers that they were a sign. A sign that the system built on chains was not unshakable. The masters feared lost profit. They feared disorder. But most of all, they feared rebellion, because rebellion spreads like fire. And once fire takes root in dry fields, it cannot be contained. The day of punishment was meant to be a lesson. The master ordered that the triplets be brought before the fields, where every man, woman, and child could see. The overseer prepared the post. The air was heavy with heat, but heavier still with fear. Punishment was not only about pain, it was about spectacle. The lash was meant to teach obedience to all who watched. The triplets were tied one by one, their arms stretched, their backs exposed. The whip cracked through the air with its sharp cry. Flesh split beneath the leather, yet no scream rose. The first blow landed, the second followed. The crowd flinched, but the siblings stood silent, their jaws set, their eyes fixed, not on the ground but on the faces of those forced to witness. The overseer struck harder. He struck until sweat poured from his brow. Still the triplets did not break. Their silence grew heavier than sound. Each absence of a cry became louder than any scream could be. For the enslaved watching it was a vision of strength. For the masters it was a vision of danger. Punishments were meant to terrify, to remind every person that the lash could reduce them to submission. But what happens when the lash fails? What happens when the body bleeds yet the spirit does not bend? That failure did not only weaken the authority of the overseer, it cracked the illusion of total control. The triplets were left tied for hours under the Sunday flies gathered on their wounds. Sweat stung the open flesh. Still, they held their silence. Mothers wept quietly in the crowd. Fathers clenched their fists but did not move. Children stared wide-eyed at the sight of endurance stronger than pain. The master believed he was making an example. Instead, he created a symbol. By the time they were cut loose, the fields were forever changed. The overseer walked away angry. The master turned away uneasy. But the enslaved carried something new in their hearts. They had seen that the whip could not reach the soul. They had seen that silence itself could be louder than defiance, shouted in words. That night the quarters filled with hushed voices. Songs rose slower and deeper, carrying the weight of what had been witnessed. The triplets lay in pain, but they had given something greater than themselves. They had shown that chains could bruise the body but could not crush the will. The master wanted obedience. What he received was fear. Fear that no punishment could tame what was growing in the hearts of his people. Night was the only time the enslaved could breathe without the constant gaze of the overseer. Darkness was their ally. It covered their steps. It muffled their movements. And within that cloak, the triplets began to weave something greater than themselves. They slipped beyond the quarters when the moon was hidden behind clouds. Paths between plantations became known to them, trails marked not on paper but in memory. They learned the rhythm of patrols and the weakness of watchful eyes. At first they carried only whispers, later they carried plans. The enslaved on neighboring lands were hungry for hope. Each plantation was a prison, but each prison was full of people who longed to break free. The triplets became messengers. They carried news of defiance. They carried songs that sounded ordinary to masters but carried hidden meanings to those who understood. A tune hummed in the field could signal a meeting by the river. A verse added to a hymn could point the way north. Stories say one of the triplets could sketch maps in the dirt with a stick, then wipe them away before dawn erased the traces. Another memorized the names of safe hollows and streams that led into the swamps. The third held the voice that carried courage. Together they formed more than a bond of blood. They became leaders in silence. Meetings were held in abandoned cabins deep in the woods. A circle of firelight would flicker against faces lined with hardship but lit with determination. Men and women spoke in hushed tones about routes of escape, about places where weapons might be hidden, about how to protect the children should the chance to flee ever come. The triplets listened. They guided. They began to shape not just their own resistance but that of many. Fear was always present. Capture meant torture. Betrayal meant death. But the promise of something greater outweighed the danger. Each night the network grew stronger. Each night the songs spread wider. What began as 3 voices became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. The masters slept uneasy in their houses with locked doors and loaded pistols. They believed control came through fear. Yet beyond their walls, the enslaved were building a power stronger than chains. The triplets had sparked it. And now the fire was moving quietly from field to field, unseen but unstoppable. By day the cotton still rose in neat rows under the burning Sunday. By night the roots of rebellion spread in silence, and the triplets were no longer just 3 children marked by omen. They were leaders of a hidden movement that promised one truth: the masters would never sleep in peace again. The overseer had always ruled with the lash. His power came from the whip coiled at his side and the fear it inspired. For years he had broken men with a glare and women with a single strike. But the triplets were different. They did not bend. They did not cry out. Each act of punishment only seemed to make them stronger. At first he tried humiliation. He forced them to kneel in front of others. He shouted their names across the fields. He ordered them to crawl through the dirt as the others watched. Yet instead of shame, the triplets carried silence. Their eyes held a fire that no mockery could dim, and the people saw it. They saw that the overseer's power slipped each time his commands failed to crush those 3. Frustration turned into rage. The whip cracked louder. The blows fell harder. One by one their backs were torn by leather. Yet they stood again. They picked up baskets. They carried on without bowing. Each scar became a mark of defiance. And those who worked beside them felt their own courage grow. The overseer began to lose sleep. His authority had always been unquestioned. Now whispers filled the night air. The people spoke of the triplets as if they carried something unshakable inside them. He noticed workers glancing at him with less fear in their eyes. He noticed small delays in the fields. He noticed that songs rose louder than before, even as his whip sliced the air. One evening he dragged the triplets into the yard and tied them to posts. He gathered the enslaved to watch. He raised his arm again and again until sweat poured from his face. But no scream came. The triplets held their silence, their heads unbowed, their eyes fixed not on him but on the sky above. The silence spread through the crowd like a wave. What was meant to be a warning became a spectacle of resistance. The overseer felt it then, authority slipping from his grasp. Fear no longer bound the people. They rallied around the triplets in quiet ways, sharing food, protecting them from further harm, refusing to betray them. Each act of kindness was rebellion. Each refusal to surrender was a stone in the crumbling wall of control. The overseer's fury grew. But with each strike his power weakened. With each punishment his authority unraveled. He was breaking not the triplets but himself. And the community began to see what he could not admit. The lash had lost its sting. The overseer's reign of fear was nearing its end. Resistance carried a price, and soon the cost became clear. The masters could not silence the triplets, but they could wound them through others. The first to be taken was a boy who had grown beside them. He had joined their secret gatherings. He had sung the coded songs. One morning he was dragged to the yard. By nightfall he was gone, sold to traders headed south. The triplets stood in silence as his mother wailed. Her cries echoed across the quarters until they faded into hoarse whispers. The lesson was plain. Defiance would not only bring the whip, it would bring the auction block. The separations came swift and cruel. A woman who had hidden food for the triplets was torn from her children and marched away. A father who had carried messages between plantations was shackled and sold at the river market. Each departure left an empty space in the quarters. Each absence was a wound no lash could match. The masters believed this would break them. They believed fear of loss would silence rebellion. But grief is not silence, it is memory. The enslaved carried those absences like fire in their chests. Each face torn away was etched into their hearts. Each name carried on their tongues became a reminder of the cruelty they endured. The triplets felt the weight of it. They watched as families who had once gathered around a single fire were scattered to the winds. They carried the guilt of knowing their defiance had drawn punishment, yet they also understood a deeper truth. Slavery thrived on isolation. It thrived on broken families. It thrived on despair. By resisting, they had forced the system to reveal its sharpest weapon, and by surviving, they proved even that weapon could not destroy the spirit of a people. At night the songs changed. They became softer, more mournful, yet also stronger. Every verse carried the names of the stolen. Every melody bound the living to the absent. The triplets sang with the others, their voices carrying grief and defiance in equal measure. The masters did not understand. They saw only sorrow. They did not see that sorrow could bind tighter than chains. They did not see that memory could be a shield. The cost of resistance was steep. Families were broken, friends were lost. Yet even in separation, the roots of defiance dug deeper. For every body sold south, the spirit of rebellion spread north, east, and west. The triplets knew then that they carried more than their own struggle. They carried the memory of every soul torn from the fields. And that memory would not die. The night was heavy with silence when the triplets made their choice. Freedom could no longer remain a dream whispered by fireside. It had to be seized, even if the cost was death. They slipped from the quarters beneath a sky veiled in clouds. Each step into the dark was a step away from chains. The swamp was their first refuge. Mud sucked at their feet, but it swallowed their tracks. Cypress trees rose like ancient guardians, their roots twisting into labyrinths that confused the hounds. The air was thick with the cries of frogs and the hum of insects. Every sound threatened to betray them. Yet every sound also masked their movements. They moved swiftly yet carefully. They knew the land was both ally and enemy. The forest gave cover, but it also hid snakes and briars. The rivers could carry them north, but they could also sweep them into drowning depths. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could mean capture. By dawn, the hunters were unleashed. Dogs bayed in the distance, their cries cutting through the morning air. The triplets pressed forward through thickets that tore at their skin. They waded through streams, hoping the water would break their scent. For hours they pressed on hearts pounding with hope and terror entwined. The bond between them was unshakable. One faltered and the others pulled them along. One stumbled and the others steadied their steps. They shared no words, for words would waste breath and invite sound. Yet each glance carried the same vow. They would not surrender, not while freedom lay ahead. The land tested them. Thorns cut their legs. Swarms of insects bit their skin raw. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Still they pressed forward. They thought of stories told by elders of Maroons who had carved hidden villages deep in the swamps. They thought of the underground paths leading north. They thought of life beyond the fields of Mississippi. But the hunters pressed closer. By the second night, torches flickered in the distance. The hounds had caught the trail again. Exhaustion slowed their limbs. The swamp that had hidden them now seemed endless. They prayed the darkness would keep them safe, but dawn always returned. For 3 nights they ran, for 3 days they hid, and still the pursuit did not end. The land was kind, but the system was relentless. By the 4th day, the sound of hounds grew near. The escape attempt hung on the edge of failure or triumph. The triplets pressed deeper into the wilderness, with freedom just out of reach and danger close behind. The night that should have carried them farther from chains ended in silence heavy with dread. For 3 days the triplets had fought the swamp and outrun the dogs. For 3 nights they had dreamed that freedom might be close enough to touch. But betrayal does not always come from the whip or the gun. Sometimes it comes from within. In the quarters, a man had been summoned to the master's house. His wife and children stood under the overseer's watch. The order was clear: betray them or watch your family be sold away. His heart carried no malice for the triplets, yet terror bent him under its weight. He gave the hunters the path, he gave the dogs their scent. And so the chase closed in. The siblings heard the hounds before they saw the torches. The sound split the night like a curse. They pushed deeper into the thickets. Water rose to their waists. Mud pulled at their legs. Still they ran, but the hunters knew exactly where to follow. By dawn, the swamp erupted with shouts. Nets were cast across the path. Dogs lunged at their heels. Clubs swung through the air. The triplets fought with every ounce of strength. One drove back a hound with a branch. Another broke free of captor's grip with teeth and nails. The third tried to lead them further into the marsh, but there were too many. They were dragged down into the mud, shackles clamped around their wrists and ankles, rope cut into their skin. The overseer himself stood over them, his face twisted in triumph and rage. He had waited for this moment, the triplets bloodied and chained at his feet. Dragged back through the quarters, the siblings did not hang their heads. The people watched in silence as they passed. Mothers held their children close. Men clenched fists but did not move. They knew what awaited. Punishment would be brutal. Yet within the silence lay something stronger than fear. The triplets had dared to run, and even in chains their defiance had not died. In the yard they were tied to posts, whips lashed across their backs until flesh tore. The overseer shouted with each strike, demanding cries of pain. None came. Blood ran into the dirt. Still, they stood silent. The masters wanted to break more than bodies. They wanted to shatter spirits, but the triplets refused to give them that victory. The one who had betrayed them stood in the crowd. His head hung low. His children clung to his legs. He did not meet their eyes, for he could not bear the weight of what had been forced upon him. The triplets understood without words. Betrayal. They had not come from hatred, but from desperation. In their silence they forgave him, even as they bled. When the whipping ended, they were left chained in the yard for all to see. The overseer called it a warning. The people called it a witness. Their bodies bore the scars of capture. Yet their eyes told another truth. They were not destroyed. They were not broken. The masters had recaptured their flesh, but their spirits still belonged to no one, and that defiance burned brighter than ever in the shadows of betrayal. Night on the plantation was usually still. The quarters would quiet after long hours in the fields. Children drifted into uneasy sleep. Elders whispered prayers in the dark. Mothers hummed low songs to silence hunger. But on this night the silence broke with the crackle of fire. At first it was only smoke curling upward through the air. A faint glow behind one of the cabins. Some thought it was just a cooking fire, left untended. But soon the glow grew into flames that licked the walls. Sparks leapt to the roof. In moments the wood hissed and roared. The fire spread with a hunger as fierce as the overseer's whip. Panic erupted. Women ran to save their children. Men grabbed buckets of water and rushed toward the blaze. Yet each bucket seemed useless against the raging flames. Sparks carried by the wind touched the next cabin, and then another. Soon the night sky glowed red. The quarters that had been a prison of wood and nails became a battlefield of smoke and heat. The masters rushed from their homes, shouting orders. The overseer barked commands for the enslaved to form lines and pass water, but fear and fury moved faster than obedience. Some obeyed, Others stood still and watched. Some whispered that the fire was no accident, that it was the hand of rebellion made visible in flame. Eyes turned to the triplets. They stood among the people, their faces lit by the blaze. No word was spoken, yet all felt their presence in that moment. Whether they had struck the first spark or not, the fire seemed to burn with their defiance. Every crack of timber breaking under the heat sounded like a chain snapping. Every ember that rose into the sky carried with it the weight of years of pain. The overseer cursed and struck at men who did not move fast enough, but his power faltered as the chaos grew. The masters feared the fire would leap from the quarters to their own houses. They feared it would consume the very fields that brought their fortune. For the first time they were not the masters of the night. The blaze was through smoke and flame. The enslaved saw something they had never seen before. The overseer afraid, the master uncertain. For once the plantation was not a place of order but of disorder, not a place of control but of collapse. When dawn came, the fire had been beaten back. Several cabins lay in ashes. Families were left without shelter. The overseer prowled through the wreckage, demanding to know who had started it, but no one spoke. Silence shielded the guilty. Silence protected the innocent. Silence turned suspicion into fear. The triplets were punished again, though no proof tied them to the spark. They were lashed, they were chained. Yet as the whip cracked, the people remembered the fire. They remembered the night when the quarters did not bow in submission but rose in flame. Whether accident or revolt, the blaze carried a truth that could not be. Hidden repression had bred fury. The fire revealed it, and the triplets' influence was undeniable. Even bound, they had given shape to a force that no lash could extinguish, a force that smoldered still in every heart that longed for freedom. The fire left scars deeper than the ashes. It scattered across the quarters. For the enslaved, it was a reminder that even walls could burn and chains could bend. For the masters, it was a wound to their sense of control. They had built their lives on certainty. Cotton would grow, orders would be obeyed. Fear would keep every man, woman, and child in line. But the blaze had shown them how fragile that order truly was. In the days that followed, the plantation house grew restless lamps, burned late into the night. Masters gathered on porches, whispering over ledgers and letters. Their voices carried unease. Their hands shook as they wrote in journals meant to be private yet soaked with fear. The entries spoke of sleepless nights. They spoke of shadows that seemed to move. They spoke of the triplets whose names had become heavy on every tongue. The idea of selling them rose often. If the three were torn apart, then perhaps their influence would dissolve. One could be sent south into the depths of Louisiana fields. Another west to Texas. Another to the markets of New Orleans. Their bond broken, their voices silenced. At least that was the thought. Yet doubt clung to the plan. Their defiance further. What if their fire was carried to every plantation they touched? The overseer pressed for harsher measures. He promised more chains, more whips, more spectacle. But even he could not hide the truth. His authority had weakened. Each strike of the lash seemed to feed the spirit of defiance rather than kill it. The people no longer bowed with the same fear. Their eyes carried a quiet challenge that haunted him as much as it haunted the masters. The journals reveal that the masters lost sleep not only over the triplets, but over the system itself. If 3 young lives could shake the foundation of a plantation, what might happen if dozens more found the same courage? What if silence became song? What if obedience became fire? Their wealth depended on the belief that resistance could always be crushed. But now that belief faltered. Some masters whispered of sending the triplets north, not to freedom, but to markets where they would vanish among strangers. Others feared that such a move would be seen as weakness. Already rumors spread across neighboring lands. Other enslaved people spoke of the triplets as if they were symbols, not flesh and blood. Separating them might only strengthen the legend. So the nights dragged on, the lamps burned low, letters piled up, filled with worry disguised as reason. Journals held words that would never be spoken aloud. In the silence of their houses, the masters felt what the had once forced upon others. Fear. They lay awake, listening to the night sounds. The wind through the fields, the distant murmur of voices from the quarters. Every noise felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed to hold rebellion. Sleep would not come. For the first time, the masters knew the torment of unrest, and they owed it to the three they could not control. The day of the auction began with silence heavier than any dawn before it. Word had spread through the quarters that the triplets would be sold. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers carried looks of helpless rage. No one spoke it aloud, but all knew what it meant. The masters believed that tearing the three apart would finally end their power. The yard was cleared. A platform was raised. Chains bound the triplets wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, as they were marched forward. The crowd of buyers gathered in their fine coats and polished boots. They came with coin purses, fat with profit, ready to dave into our fat, bid on flesh, as if they were bidding on tools or beasts. The auctioneer stood tall, his voice sharp, as he called out the virtues of strong young bodies. He pointed to the scars on their backs, not as wounds of cruelty, but as proof of the inexproblements, endurance. He spoke of their age, their strength, their value, but when his words reached the part about separating them, he stumbled, for the three stood side by side, not looking at him but looking out across the crowd, their eyes unbroken, their silence louder than any cry could have been. The first bid rose. Then another. Yet the sound of coins clinking against wood was met with something else. A murmur from the crowd of enslaved forced to watch. It began low, a hum like wind through tall grass. Then it grew into rhythm. A song. Not of joy, but of defiance. The very same coded hymns the triplets had carried through the fields now rose like thunder around the block. The masters shouted for silence. The overseer raised his whip. Yet the song did not stop. It spread. Men sang with clenched jaws. Women lifted their voices with tears in their eyes. Children echoed the refrain, though they barely knew the meaning. The sound filled the yard. It filled the air above the auction block. Buyers shifted uneasily. Some stepped back from the stage. The triplets did not move, but their presence burned through the song like fire through dry wood. The auctioneer struck the block with his cane, demanding order. He tried to raise the price, shouting louder. But each attempt was drowned in the chorus. The overseer lashed out, striking at the singers. Still they did not break. Instead, more voices joined until the very ground seemed to tremble. Buyers whispered that this place was cursed. Some refused to raise another bid. Others left altogether, muttering about rebellion. The masters turned pale. Their plan to shatter the triplets had only bound the people tighter. At last the auction was abandoned. Buyers dispersed, leaving the platform empty, except for the three still standing in chains. The overseer raged. The masters argued among themselves, but the enslaved returned to the quarters carrying the sound of that song with them. The triplets had not been sold. They had not been torn apart. The attempt to break them had instead revealed the strength of unity. The auction block meant to divide had become a stage of resistance, and from that day forward the people knew their voices together could shake the very foundation of the system that bound them. The cotton fields had always been a place of toil. From the first light of dawn until the sun slipped below the horizon, the land swallowed sweat and hope. But on this day the fields became something else. The masters had failed to sell the triplets. They had failed to silence the voices rising in song. Fear spread among them like a sickness. And fear often gives birth to violence. The overseer stalked the rows with his whip already drawn. His eyes burned with rage and humiliation. The triplets bent to their labor as ordered, but their every movement carried defiance. It was not in words, but in the way they held their line. Backs straight and their eyes level with the horizon. Others noticed. The enslaved saw and understood. A spark smoldered in the air, unseen but undeniable. The spark caught when the overseer lashed one of the brothers across the shoulders with no cause. The sound cracked through the field. Instead of dropping to his knees, the boy turned and faced him. His silence was louder than a scream. Overseer lifted the whip again. But before it could fall, a hand reached out and stopped it. It was not one of the triplets, but another man from the quarters. Then another stepped forward. Then a woman. In an instant, the quiet rows of cotton transformed into a storm of motion. Shouts broke out. Tools meant for harvest became weapons. Sticks, stones, rusted blades, even bare fists, swung with fury, long held back. The overseer called for the hounds. He cried for the masters. But the dogs hesitated. Even beasts seemed to sense. The tide had turned. The masters came running, pistols drawn, voices cracking as they ordered obedience. Yet their commands scattered like dust in the wind. The field no longer belonged to them. Blood stained the cotton. The triplets stood at the center of it all, moving not as children but as forces of something larger. One fought barehanded, wresting the whip from the overseer. Another shielded the weaker and the wounded, guiding them away from gunfire. The third raised his voice, not in song but in a cry that rallied hearts more fiercely than steel. For the first time, the enslaved were not only surviving, they were fighting. The violence was brief, but it burned hot. Shots rang out, men fell, women screamed. The soil drank both blood and sweat until the lines between oppressor and oppressed blurred in the haze of smoke and dust. When it ended, the air carried the stare, heavy silence of aftermath. The masters stumbled back, battered and shaken. Some of the enslaved lay still, their bodies broken. Yet even in grief there was no regret. The triplets, though bloodied, still stood unbowed. The fields would be forced back into order, chains would be tightened, punishments would be crueler than before, but nothing could erase what had happened. In those rows of cotton, a truth had been carved deep. The enslaved were not voiceless. They were not powerless. The triplets had shown that refusal could ignite more than fear. It could ignite resistance. Stories spread beyond the plantation, carried in whispers across miles of swamp and forest. Some said the triplets had been blessed by spirits. Others said their courage had drawn fire from the very earth. Whatever the tale, each retelling grew. What mattered was not the wounds left behind, but the legend born in the cotton fields. A legend of blood, a legend of defiance, a legend that even chains could not contain. The fields grew quiet again after the storm of blood and fire, but silence is never the same once it has been broken. The cotton grew back, the overseers cracked their whips, the masters counted their profits, yet beneath the surface nothing returned to what it once was. The triplets, though scarred in body, remained unbroken in spirit. Their defiance lingered in the air like smoke long after the flames had gone. The masters feared them more than ever. They feared their influence. They feared the way eyes turned toward them whenever orders were given. They feared the memory of resistance that could not be erased with chains or whips. Some spoke of selling them away. Others whispered of harsher punishments. But in truth, the damage had already been done. The power of the masters had cracked, and once cracked, it could never be made whole again. The triplets' names were never written into the ledgers of history. The records of the plantation did not preserve their voices or their dreams. To the masters they were bodies, tools, property. But to those who had seen them stand tall in the cotton fields, they were proof that courage could bloom even in the harshest soil. Stories carried their memory across rivers and forests, with every step of a runaway, with every whispered song around a dying fire, with every mother who told her child that freedom was not a fantasy. The legend of the triplets endured. Their lives became echoes in the struggles that followed. The great uprisings of enslaved people carried the same spirit. The flight of families along the secret routes north carried the same fire. The voices that would one day rise in churches and courthouses carried the same defiance. The triplets did not live to see freedom written into law, but freedom bore their fingerprints all the same. What masters never understood was that control over land and chains upon bodies could not reach the heart. Spirit cannot be owned. Spirit cannot be broken. Every lash meant to silence only made the silence louder. Every sail meant to divide only spread the fire wider. In trying to crush the triplets, the masters gave birth to something they could never master. And so their story closes, not with victory written in ink, but with echoes carved in memory. They lived, they fought, they refused, and in their refusal they became more than 3 young souls bound to the fields. They became a thread in the fabric of resistance. a thread that wove itself through generations until one day the world they dreamed of came closer to being. Their names may be lost, their faces may be gone, but their spirit endures. It moves like wind across the cotton. It lingers in the songs that once carried hope through the night. It waits in every heart that dares to say no. The triplets were not meant to be remembered. Yet memory has a way of clinging to truth. And the truth is simple. They could be chained. They could be beaten. They could be sold. But they could not be controlled. The hidden legacy of resistance is made of countless stories like theirs. And together those stories shaped a nation,